It gives me great pleasure, in every sense of the word, to introduce a man who was my friend and colleague in the anti-war, anti-draft movement in the 1960s in Hawaii, a man I had not seen for 40 years until 5 hours ago. Jim Douglas has devoted his life to the pursuit of truth, peace, and justice. He has written 4 books on the theology of nonviolence and has been active in diverse related practices relating to nuclear war, conscientious objection, and providing a refuge for those in need due to political repression. His current book, JFK and the Unspeakable, is the most authoritative work yet produced on the who, the what, and the why of the JFK assassination. Jim has come to Maine as the first stop on a New England tour from his Catholic Worker House of Hospitality in Birmingham, Alabama, for the homeless. Let's all give a very warm welcome to Jim Douglas.
Aloha. Yeah, 40 years ago. That wasn't long ago, was it? No. I'm sharing mainly on the why, not so much the how, because that would go on for months and years, and the why is the key, whether it's in relation to JFK, Obama, or the unspeakable. John Kennedy lived with the raven on his shoulder. From an early age, death was his companion. From his earliest memories as a child, death was always there. Lying in bed with scarlet fever when he was 2 and 3 years old, suffering from illnesses that never seemed to end, a chronic blood condition in boarding school, a debilitating combination of colitis and ulcers, intestinal ailments while he was at Harvard, osteoporosis and crippling back problems intensified by war injuries that plagued him until the end of his life. To those who knew him well, Jack Kennedy always seemed to be sick and dying. Death was always just a step away. He did not fear it. What Kennedy came to fear, especially when he became president, was not his own death, but the death of humanity by nuclear war. Kennedy's fear of nuclear war deepened after his 1961 meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna. Late at night, on the June 5, 1961 plane flight back to Washington, the weary president asked his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, if she would please file the documents he had been working on. As she started to clear the table in the plane, Evelyn Lincoln noticed a little slip of paper that had fallen on the floor that he had written on. On it were 2 lines in Kennedy's handwriting, a favorite saying of his from Abraham Lincoln. I know there is a God, and I see a storm coming. If he has a place for me, I believe that I am ready. The summit meeting with Khrushchev had deeply disturbed Kennedy. The American president thought the Soviet chairman had shown no real concern about nuclear war, and that he was unwilling to compromise, making a nuclear holocaust far more likely. Thus, Kennedy saw a terrifying storm coming. Yet, if God had a place for him, he believed that he was ready. John F. Kennedy was in the same dire position every U.S. president has been in since World War II. As president, Kennedy was under the control of what his predecessor, Dwight D. Eisenhower, identified in his farewell address as the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower said, "Its total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government." The military-industrial complex, more powerful today than ever, imprisons the president. A president is always accompanied by a military attaché bearing a nuclear code that can incinerate the earth. That gun to the world is a gun to the president. When he accepts the power to kill everyone, the president becomes a prisoner morally and politically to the demands of our national security state. Whether his name is Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, or Barack Obama, once he accepts nuclear power over the world, his permissible movement as president is confined to a very tight space, tighter than we as citizens might imagine. President Kennedy rebelled against the economic, political, even spiritual influence that President Eisenhower described. During JFK's 2 years and 10 months in power, while that power pressured him relentlessly, he compromised with it to survive a few months. But in the end, he stood his ground and took the bullets. Kennedy's transformation was prophesied in a strange way by the great Trappist monk and writer Thomas Merton. In a letter Merton wrote to a friend in January 1962, 1 year into Kennedy's presidency, the monk summed up the president in a negative, yet prophetic way. He said, "I have little confidence in Kennedy. I think he cannot fully measure up to the magnitude of his task and lacks creative imagination and the deeper kind of sensitivity that is needed. Too much the Time and Life magazine mentality, than which I can imagine nothing further in reality from, say, Lincoln. What is needed in the president is really not shrewdness or craft, but what the politicians don't have: depth, humanity, and a certain totality of self-forgetfulness and compassion, not just for individuals, but for humanity as a whole. A deeper kind of dedication. Maybe Kennedy will break through into that someday by miracle. But such people are before long marked out for assassination. The unspeakable is a term that Thomas Merton coined at the heart of the 60s after JFK's assassination, in the midst of the escalating Vietnam War, the nuclear arms race, and the further assassinations of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert Kennedy. In each of those soul-shaking events, Merton sensed an evil whose depth and deceit seemed to go beyond the capacity of words to describe. Nuclear war was an expression of the unspeakable. Thomas Merton saw that if Kennedy became what he needed to be, he would be marked out for assassination. How clearly did Kennedy see the dangers to himself if he met the coming storm faithfully? JFK was asked one day by friends what he thought of 7 Days in May, a best-selling novel that described a military takeover in the United States. He replied that if, as he said, the country had a young president and he had a Bay of Pigs incident, there would be a certain uneasiness. The military would criticize him behind his back. Then if there were another Bay of Pigs, the reaction of the country would be, is he too young and inexperienced? The military would almost feel that it was their patriotic obligation to stand ready to preserve the integrity of the nation, and only God knows just what segment of democracy they would be defending if they overthrew the elected establishment. Pausing a moment, he went on, then if there were a third Bay of Pigs, it could happen. Waiting again until his listeners absorbed his meaning, he concluded with an old Navy phrase, but it won't happen on my watch. As we know, the young President John Kennedy did have a Bay of Pigs in the first spring of his short presidency. The CIA lied to Kennedy about the political and geographic conditions that premised his approval of the agency's Cuban exile brigade landing at the Bay of Pigs. He realized afterwards he had been set up. He had to either send U.S. combat troops into Cuba to supersede the CIA's feudal exile brigade, as he'd said in advance he would never do, or accept a huge defeat. After the revealing CIA documents were finally declassified, the way National Public Radio commentator Daniel Shore put it was, in effect, President Kennedy was the target of a CIA covert operation that collapsed when the invasion collapsed. JFK swallowed defeat instead of committing U.S. troops. He then said, in recognition of the CIA's trap, that he wanted to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. The Bay of Pigs enabled Kennedy to see the cloaked demands of the CIA and the Pentagon as a usurpation of his power as president. He began to break free from his military and intelligence commanders. Prisoners get shot for doing that. JFK's decision to fire CIA Director Allen Dulles and his deputies in the wake of the Bay of Pigs was his first step toward freedom, meaning also death. When JFK bowled over Kingpin Allen Dulles, who would return to power as the most influential member of the so-called Warren Commission, it was really the Dulles Commission, when he did that, when Kennedy fired Dulles, the upstart president was acting as if he were in charge, not his military and intelligence commanders. Kennedy was shocked by the CIA's scheming against him at the Bay of Pigs. And the CIA was shocked by Kennedy's removal of Dulles. Who did he think he was? President? The steel crisis, which we hear nothing about from historians of that era these days, was JFK's second Bay of Pigs, his second step toward freedom and death. On April 10, 1962, U.S. Steel Chairman Roger Blau informed President Kennedy that Blau's company was raising steel prices by 3.5%, breaking an agreement to control inflation that the president had just brokered between U.S. Steel and the United Steel Workers. U.S. Steel was joined publicly in the price hike by 5 other companies already in collusion with it. JFK was furious at being double-crossed, and I won't quote him. The words he used were furious words. He and the President and Attorney General Robert Kennedy launched an all-out campaign to force the heads of the 6 colluding companies to cancel their price increase. The Justice Department raided Big Steel's corporate offices. Robert Kennedy subpoenaed the steel executives' personal and company records. The Kennedys were going for broke. Most ominously for Big Steel, the president ordered the Defense Department to market its steel business overseas so as to take huge profits out of the hands of U.S. Steel and its cohorts at the heart of the military-industrial complex. Faced by the fact that the Kennedys meant business, their business, the steelheads surrendered quickly, rescinding their price raise. However, they accomplished a more sinister purpose. A Fortune magazine editorial stated, with an insider's knowledge, that U.S. Steel's decision to raise prices, made by a board of directors comprised of the financial elite of the country and of the world, was designed to present the president with a dilemma. Either he had to accept the price hike and lose credibility, or push back and unite the business world against him, as he did. Fortune publisher Henry Luce, the most powerful media magnate in the world, was behind the editorial. Drawing on Shakespeare's prediction by the soothsayer of Julius Caesar's assassination, "Beware the Ides of March," the Luce editorial's title warned Kennedy of the fate he was tempting by his stand against imperial power. Luce called his editorial "Steel, the Ides of April." The powers that be had to be more than a little angry to be threatening the president so boldly. An American parable was in the making. As Kennedy turned heretically toward peace after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the parable of the president and the powers would be played out until it climaxed a year later on a sunny street in Dallas. Then it would be up to us to open our ears and hear. I'm a Catholic worker. I know there are others here. I am deeply skeptical of the power of kings and presidents, all of them. But what I also learned from Dorothy Day, mother of the Catholic worker movement, was a belief in the goodness of every human being. Dorothy had that belief in John Kennedy. She told me pointedly, after JFK's death, study his life. I didn't know, when she told me that she and Kennedy had met. Young Jack Kennedy and his older brother Joe, who would die in World War II, visited the Mott Street Catholic worker in Manhattan one day in the summer of 1940. Catholic worker Stanley Wisniewski recalled the incident in an interview with Bill Moyers. He said, "I remember distinctly how bewildered John Kennedy was by the sight of the poverty and the misery of the place. And then Dorothy came in. She talked to him. Then Dorothy says, 'Come and have supper with us.' And Kennedy looked at her a little startled and says, 'No, come out and have dinner with us instead.' So Dorothy and Joe and John Kennedy, we went out to a little restaurant around the corner. We had a wonderful conversation. They talked long into the night. As Dorothy put it when she wrote about it in her book, Loaves and Fishes, they talked long into the night of war and peace and of man and the state. Dorothy Day and John and Joe Kennedy and Stanley Wisniewski. Even when Dorothy Day was marching and speaking out decades later against JFK's Cold War policies, something about him struck the chord of her belief in human goodness. So she said after he was killed, "Pay attention, learn more about his life." It took me over 30 years to follow that recommendation. Yes, we can learn more from his life and his death. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy had to confront the unspeakable in the form of total nuclear war. At the height of the terrifying conflict that his own anti-Castro policies had helped precipitate, he felt the situation spiraling out of control, especially because of pressures and provocations by the Pentagon, led by General Curtis LeMay. LeMay, as the Air Force Chief of Staff, was sending U.S. planes into Soviet zones to try to provoke a response from the Soviet Union. U.S. had more nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union, a large number more, and was hoping to win by striking as soon as a provocation could be aroused. LeMay also ordered that test missiles be fired from Vandenberg Air Force Base into the Pacific. This is in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, at Vandenberg Air Force Base out in California, there were silos with missiles with nuclear warheads on them. And beside them were silos that were used for test firing missiles. The Soviets couldn't be assured that one wasn't the other. And LeMay was test firing missiles. And this is the kind of thing that was happening in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that Kennedy was becoming more and more profoundly aware of. How John and Robert Kennedy felt in those days is best conveyed by Robert's description of his brother at one of the most terrible moments of the crisis. On Wednesday, October 24th, a report came in that a Soviet submarine was about to be intercepted by U.S. helicopters with depth charges, unless, by some miracle, the two Soviet ships it was accompanying turned back from the U.S., well, they called it a quarantine line. It was a blockade. The president feared he had lost all control of the situation and that nuclear war was just about to happen. Robert looked at his brother. He describes this in a book that was published after Robert's assassination from his notes. His hand went up to his face and covered his mouth. He opened and closed his fist. His face seemed drawn, his eyes pained, almost gray. We stared at each other across the table. For a few fleeting seconds, it was almost as though no one else was there and he was no longer the president. Then the miracle occurred. Through the enemy, Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev ordered the Soviet ships to stop dead in the water rather than challenge the U.S. quarantine. At that moment, he saved John Kennedy and everyone else. The enemy, Nikita Khrushchev, did. What moved Khrushchev to his decision? The incident goes unmentioned in his memoirs, as does another hidden chapter of events that may help to explain it. Nikita Khrushchev's secret correspondence with John Kennedy. Khrushchev had sent his first private letter to Kennedy on September 29, 1961, from the Soviet premier's retreat beside the Black Sea. So a letter that began quite beautifully with Khrushchev reflecting on what he was looking out at, and how could it be that he and the president were locked in a struggle which could mean the desolation of all that he was looking at. It wasn't a little letter, it was 26 pages long. So, how'd he get it to Kennedy? It was wrapped in a newspaper and brought to Kennedy's press secretary by a Soviet magazine editor, so-called. He's a KGB agent. So he gives it to Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary, and Salinger, well, the president doesn't need another newspaper. Look inside. And in his letter that he sent to the president, Khrushchev emphasized his common ground with Kennedy by, this is the communist writing, a biblical analogy. Khrushchev liked, he said, the comparison of their situation, his and John Kennedy's, with Noah's Ark, where both the clean and the unclean found sanctuary. But regardless, Khrushchev wrote, of who lists himself with the clean and who is considered to be unclean, they are all equally interested in one thing, and that is that the Ark should successfully continue its cruise. And we have no other alternative. Either we should live in peace and cooperation so that the Ark maintains its buoyancy, or else it sinks. Kennedy responded privately to Khrushchev from his own place of retreat beside the ocean, Hyannisport. The president agreed wholeheartedly, he wrote, with Khrushchev's biblical image. He said, I like very much your analogy of Noah's Ark, with both the clean and the unclean determined that it stay afloat. Whatever our differences, our collaboration to keep the peace is as urgent, if not more urgent, than our collaboration to win the last world war. And so it was that, even as they faced each other on the verge of total nuclear war a year later, it was thanks to their secret letters that each knew the other as a human being he could respect. They also knew that they had once agreed warmly that the world was a Noah's Ark where both the clean and the unclean had to keep it afloat. It was in just such a world where clean and unclean were together under a nuclear threat that Khrushchev stopped his ships dead in the water and the Ark remained afloat. Yet the crisis was not over. Work on the Soviet missile sites in Cuba was actually speeding up. Then a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance plane over Cuba, killing the Air Force pilot. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Executive Committee of the National Security Council had already recommended immediate retaliation in such a case. They now urged an all-out attack early the next morning upon Cuba and ultimately the Soviet Union. There was the feeling, said Robert Kennedy, that the noose was tightening on all of us, on Americans, on humankind, and that the bridges to escape were crumbling. However, JFK called off the Air Force reprisal for the U-2's downing. He continued the search for a peaceful resolution. The President and the Attorney General then met in the Oval Office, the two brothers, and JFK shared with his brother what his deepest fear was. And Robert described this also in his notes, published after his death. The thought that disturbed him the most, Robert said, and that made the prospect of war much more fearful than it would otherwise have been, was the specter of the death of the children of this country and all the world. The young people who had no role, who had no say, who knew nothing even of the confrontation, but whose lives would be snuffed out like everyone else's. They would never have a chance to make a decision, to vote in an election, to run for office, to lead a revolution, to determine their own destinies. It was this, wrote Robert, that troubled him most, that gave him such pain. The thought that troubled President Kennedy so much, that gave him such pain, was one of compassion. A compassion toward the children of this world who had no role in a nuclear war and would not survive it. It was a transforming moment in Kennedy's life. It was what Thomas Merton had envisioned when he wrote, "Maybe Kennedy will break through into that totality of self-forgetfulness and compassion someday by miracle, but such people are before long marked out for assassination." When JFK experienced that moment of turning, he made the most crucial decision of his presidency, of his life. He decided that his brother Robert should meet secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and personally convey the president's great concern, as Robert put it. At a moment when the world was falling into darkness, with the Joint Chiefs and all of Kennedy's advisors pressuring him, now we can't keep going on with this and taking it, we have to attack. At that moment, Kennedy did what his generals and the CIA thought was unforgivable. He not only rejected their pressures for attacking Cuba and the Soviet Union, even worse, the president reached out to the enemy for help. That could be considered treason. Nikita Khrushchev saw it as hope. When Robert Kennedy met with Dobrynin in Washington, he warned the Soviet ambassador that the president was losing control to his generals and needed the Soviets' help. So it was that when Khrushchev received Kennedy's plea for help in Moscow, he turned to his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, and he said, "We have to let Kennedy know that we want to help him." Khrushchev hesitated when he heard himself say, "help." Just when the US president seemed to be at his wit's end, did he, Khrushchev, really want to help his enemy? Yes, he did. He repeated the word help to his foreign minister and said, "Yes, help. We now have a common cause to save the world from those pushing us toward war." So how can we understand that moment? The two most heavily armed leaders in history, on the verge of total nuclear war, suddenly joined hands against those on both sides pressuring them to attack. Khrushchev ordered the immediate withdrawal of his missiles in return for Kennedy's public pledge never to invade Cuba and his secret promise to withdraw US missiles from Turkey, as he would in fact do. The two Cold War enemies had turned so that each now had more in common with his opponent than either had with his own generals. Neither John Kennedy or Nikita Khrushchev was a saint. Each was deeply complicit in policies that brought humankind to the brink of nuclear war. Yet when they encountered the void, they turned to each other for help. In doing so, they turned humanity toward the hope of a peaceful planet. Kennedy kept walking in that direction, as did Khrushchev. JFK gave his greatest speech on June 10, 1963 at American University. In it, he envisioned an end to the Cold War, saying he was stopping atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, and we will not be the first to resume unilateral stopping. He said he wanted to negotiate a test ban treaty with the Soviets as soon as possible in Moscow. Moscow, not Washington, a less hostile context for negotiation with the enemy than the president's own Washington. His long-range goal, he said, this is what he said was his long-range goal: general and complete disarmament, designed to take place by stages, permitting parallel political developments to build the new institutions of peace which would take the place of arms. Khrushchev responded in the same spirit. In an astonishing 6 weeks, the two leaders agreed to the partial nuclear test ban treaty. 6 weeks they negotiated that treaty. The way in which they did it, the Russians couldn't believe this process. Averell Harriman was the personal representative of John Kennedy. He went over to Moscow to negotiate with the Soviet negotiators. Every time they came to a critical point where there was conflict, Harriman would say, "Excuse me," and he'd go off, get on the telephone. Where was he going? He phoned Kennedy, who was waiting for him in the White House. Kennedy did the direct negotiating with all the Soviet negotiators. Everything was checked immediately with Kennedy, and they did the whole thing in 6 weeks. And it also, as an end run around all of Kennedy's military advisors, none of whom supported what he was doing. He didn't ask their advice. He just went and did it. Kennedy said, however, once they negotiated the treaty and he and Khrushchev agreed, that getting Senate ratification for it would be, as he put it, almost in the nature of a miracle. This term miracle keeps coming up. The president then convened peace activists, business leaders, women's magazine editors, union activists, scientists, and religious leaders in a White House council. He got all these people together in a White House council to organize massive citizen support for the treaty. Norman Cousins was the person who was his coordinator. A peace activist did this. Their grassroots campaign turned public opinion around. It was a massive grassroots public education campaign. And the Senate passed the Test Ban Treaty by a large majority in September 1963. In the midst of the Cold War, this happened. Also in September, we're talking about now 2 months before Kennedy's assassination. Also in September, JFK initiated a secret dialogue with Fidel Castro through U.S. UN diplomat William Atwood to normalize U.S.-Cuban relations. This is in 1963, September. Kennedy's first back-channel representative in that dialogue, French reporter Jean Daniel, was actually meeting with Castro on the afternoon of November 22, 1963, when they heard the news. That, as Castro said, changed everything. The U.S.-Cuban dialogue died in Dallas, and is still dead. On October, this is the next month now, 1 month before, on October 11, 1963, JFK signed National Security Action Memorandum 263. It ordered a U.S. troop withdrawal from Vietnam to bring home 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963, and by the end of 1965, the bulk of U.S. personnel, an order that President Johnson quietly voided. The Vietnam War was reignited in Dallas. President Kennedy's courageous turn from global war to a strategy of peace provides the why of his assassination. Because he turned toward peace with our enemies, the communists, he found himself at odds with his own national security state. Peacemaking had risen to the top of his agenda as president. That was not the kind of leadership the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the military-industrial complex wanted in the White House. Given the Cold War dogmas that gripped those dominant powers, and given Kennedy's turn toward peace, his assassination followed as a matter of course. It was a transparent act of state. Just as John Kennedy did, Barack Obama had a Bay of Pigs early in his presidency. He became the target of a covert operation that trapped and compromised him as president. In Obama's case, the challenge to his authority as commander-in-chief came not from the CIA, but from the Army, and not in Cuba, but in Afghanistan. As in Kennedy's case, Obama's response to the entrapment established the pattern of his presidency, but in a direction opposite to Kennedy's. Obama has become an obedient servant to his national security state, and as a result, a source of despair to many of his supporters. The critical background to President Obama's June 2010, this year, his June firing of General Stanley McChrystal for his outlandish Rolling Stone interview, was McChrystal's close relationship to the man Obama named to replace him. The president's newly appointed Afghan commander, replacing McChrystal, David H. Petraeus, was McChrystal's boss and mentor. In September 2009, last year, McChrystal had been Petraeus's point man in a Pentagon threat of revolt unless the president escalated the Afghan war. Heavily supported by Republican leaders, General McChrystal pressured Obama publicly by a series of statements questioning the president's initial resistance to the general's recommendation of 40,000 more troops. Petraeus himself also went public, telling a columnist the U.S. would fail in the war unless the president gave the generals the troops they needed. Obama's generals were conducting a media war to force him into a decision they had already chosen for him. As Secretary of State Colin Powell's former top aide, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, observed, quote, Petraeus and McChrystal have put Obama in a trick bag. You know the book that came out 2 days ago, Bob Woodward's Obama's Wars. I've been reading it. As Woodward reported in Obama's Wars, the president was blocked at every turn by his war cabinet as he sought alternative troop options and an exit plan from the war. However, the generals wanted their troop surge and an open-ended strategy for the war. They provided no exit plan. He kept saying, I want an exit plan. He didn't get it. So he said to the generals, you're not really giving me any options. You agreed to go back and work those up. Where are the options? Instead, they kept pressuring him for the same troop increase under different guises. They put it in different words. It's the same options. And in a war without end, no exit. It's unacceptable, Obama said. Obama told his civilian advisors that the military heads were, quote, really cooking the thing in the direction they wanted. They are not going to give me a choice, unquote. So in the end, the president finally gave them 30,000 more troops, 10,000 less, while setting a shaky condition-based date of next July for a beginning withdrawal. The generals claimed victory. Petraeus was pleased. His counterinsurgency strategy was alive and well in Afghanistan. As he let Woodward know, if the president had told him at the beginning that it would come out with this strategy and 30,000 troops, Petraeus would have taken it in a second. Got what he wanted. Moreover, General Petraeus said privately he continued to see no end in sight in the Afghan war. Quote, you have to recognize also that I don't think you win this war. I think you keep fighting. This is the kind of fight we're in for the rest of our lives and probably our kids' lives. Our kids' lives. When Obama replaced McChrystal half a year later by the more subtle, more controlling Petraeus, it was a further submission to the military authorities that the president was elected to command. After JFK was set up by the CIA with the Pentagon's support at the Bay of Pigs, that new young president bucked his national security state, firing his main adversary, Cold Warrior-in-Chief Allen Dulles. He was at the top of the Cold War hierarchy. When Obama was set up by General Petraeus, General McChrystal and their colleagues to escalate the war in Afghanistan, our new young president, after, to his credit, months of deliberation, reluctantly went along. His later insertion of Petraeus as his new Afghan commander put the most likely Republican candidate for president in 2012, General David Petraeus, in an ideal running position. Because Bush's surge of occupying troops in Iraq under Petraeus has somehow been judged a win, Obama will be scapegoated with the loss if a proxy government in Iraq fails after his troop withdrawal. This past August, last month, General Petraeus warned, if the U.S. loses in Afghanistan, there would likely be a bloody civil war followed by a takeover by extremists. He added, if the U.S. succeeds and Afghanistan stabilizes, the country could become the region's new Silk Road with the potential to extract trillions of dollars worth of minerals. That was on Meet the Press. If Petraeus fails, if he fails in his counterinsurgency war to pacify that new road to corporate profits, he can keep on saying he needed more troops and more time to win there, preparing the political ground for another Obama loss. Petraeus can then return home for a Republican draft to run for president. Obama, by surrendering to his generals, has been trapped in the same kind of plotting Kennedy had the insight and courage to resist. Barack Obama is also a very smart and sometimes courageous man. Why did he submit to his generals by widening a disastrous war? Did he think he could at least use his waning power to improve the domestic state of the Union, while hoping he could eventually find a way out of our downward spiral of war in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran? If so, he will finally have to say no, for the sake of us all, to his generals and the powers behind them. They will always want the troops to fight more battles for the rest of our lives and probably our kids' lives toward the end of trillions of dollars worth of minerals on a new Silk Road. They'll always want to keep on going. Can any president of the United States turn toward peace without being threatened, set up, and if necessary, in quotes, from the standpoint of our national security state, assassinated? Can any president? Because of our unwillingness to connect the dots of Dallas with those of Washington, U.S. citizens have been unable to raise that post-JFK question to consciousness. In the Washington of Barack Obama, where some speak of a president's assassination casually and others deliberately, it is time that we dealt with the question in a serious way. John Kennedy did. From his frequent remarks anticipating his own death, friends said he was obsessed by it. He seems rather to have seen his death in a remarkably detached way in a time of darkness, accepting his own death, if necessary, from the standpoint of his conscience, as the simple consequence of doing his duty. Once we face the why of Kennedy's assassination, never really mysterious, and now a story documented by the mass of files made public by the Assassination Records Review Board, we can deal with an obvious question that has likely passed through the mind of Barack Obama. Can a peacemaking president survive a war-making state? Can a peacemaking president survive a war-making state? A conscientious president's survival and the carrying out of peace initiatives against the grain of his government and corporate power is entwined with the survival of every human being on earth. The president's vulnerability, while he tries to turn a massive Washington warship toward peace and disarmament, is an unspeakable fact of our politics. But the other side of the unspeakable is ourselves. Our sense of despair when we see a president's reluctance to choose what may kill him raises questions about ourselves. Martin Luther King said in his last testament, a little book published after his death called Trumpet of Conscience, can a nonviolent direct action movement find application on the international level to confront economic and political problems? I believe it can. It is clear to me that the next stage of the movement is to become international. King envisioned an international movement of massive, nonviolent civil disobedience, bringing the business of London, Paris, Washington, and Ottawa to a halt until such centers of autocracy addressed the real questions of democracy. He said we needed to shut down our marketplaces by nonviolent action until business as usual was opened up to the needs of us all, beginning with the poorest, most exploited people on earth. The way our greatest prophet addressed the military-industrial complex was to think and act beyond it. That is why he planned the Poor People's Campaign for Washington. He was initiating it in Memphis in April 1968, supporting the sanitation workers' strike there when he was shot to death. He wanted all those who had nothing to lose to come together in D.C. that spring and summer, however long it would take, to shut down the government by nonviolent resistance until it agreed to shut down poverty and war. Martin Luther King was saying that Washington and Wall Street did not have the final say. There was and is a world out there. From the heartland of the USA to the heartbeat of the Congo, from those suffering in Appalachia to those struggling in the Amazon. If we are willing to struggle, suffer, and die together nonviolent, anything is possible for our world. King's global nonviolent vision is waiting to be realized if we are willing to carry it out, paying the price just as he did. Martin King, like the prophets before him, knew the towering powers that overwhelm us when we think small are themselves small time. He reminded us that our Pentagon generals and Wall Street barons are not in ultimate charge of reality any more than we as individuals are. The arc of the universe, he said, bends toward justice. So let's not give up on our brother Barack Obama or on ourselves. And let's not give up on our brothers and sisters in the Pentagon and on Wall Street. Nonviolence is the most powerful force in existence. We can all become part of its movement. On the first day of school, September 8, 2009, at Wakefield High School, Arlington, Virginia, a ninth grader whose name was Lily asked President Obama, if you could have dinner with anyone, dead or alive, who would it be? The president said his first choice for a dinner companion would be Gandhi. He said, a real hero of mine, because if it hadn't been for the nonviolent movement in India, you might not have seen the same nonviolent movement for civil rights here in the United States. He ended up doing so much and changing the world just by the power of his ethics, by his ability to change how people saw each other and saw themselves. Gandhi was able to help people who thought they had no power realize that they had power, and then help people who had a lot of power realize that if all they're doing is oppressing people, then that's not a really good exercise of power. So maybe we all need to sit down for a meal with Gandhi. One that would be, as President Obama then told Lily, a really small meal. Because he, like the people he represented, didn't eat a lot. No. What Gandhi would say to us over that small meal, he did say at the end of his life to a U.S. writer, Vincent Sheehan, who traveled halfway around the world from a farmhouse not too far from here in Vermont, to question him on vital matters, anticipating that Gandhi was about to be assassinated, as he would be in Sheehan's presence 3 days later. As the two men paced a room together, Gandhi told his American visitor, with reference to World War II, culminating in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Your ends may have been good, but your means were bad. That is not the way of truth. If Gandhi's earnest conversation partner were Obama, not Sheehan, and the time today, perhaps the next question would be, what is the way of truth in Afghanistan? For Gandhi, truth was God. Truth force was his term for nonviolence, satyagraha. Gandhi acted on the belief that there is nothing we as human beings can do that is more powerful, more transforming than to live out the truth as we know it at the deepest point in our conscience. So in a dialogue today with a powerful man who knows that oppressing people is not a really good exercise of power, Gandhi would say that hearing the truth and acting on it, regardless of the consequences to one's power and one's self, would be the way of truth in Afghanistan and in Washington. As politically confining as the White House is, it is for that very reason an ideal place to live out the truth, as President Kennedy did. The ultimate reach of Lily's question is a challenging one for us all. And President Obama's Gandhian response is a seed of hope. The month before his election as president, Barack Obama also invoked Gandhi as an inspiration. On that occasion, Gandhi as the community organizer of a massive nonviolent revolution. President-to-be Obama said, quote, "Gandhi's portrait hangs in my office to remind me that real change will not come from Washington. It will come when the people, united, bring it to Washington." Obama's pre-election Gandhi statement included a reference to the war in Iraq. Quote, "We've watched our standing in the world erode as we continue to lose American lives in a war that should never have been authorized and never been waged." Candidate Obama's words on Iraq apply with equal urgency today to the war in Afghanistan and a threatened war in Iran in the context of a global strategy of war on terror that, as Gandhi would say, is not the way of truth. John Kennedy recognized that the wars he was pressured to wage on Cuba, on Vietnam, and on the Soviet Union all claimed as strategic parts of a global war on communism were not the way of truth. With great courage, he turned away from those wars and from the false ideology of war that justified them toward the truth of peacemaking. Had he not done so in the Cuban Missile Crisis, our planet would now be a nuclear wasteland. We can give thanks for the courage that took him to Dallas. Yet the vision of Gandhi and King and the words of Obama remind us that the impetus for the kind of nonviolent change that is the condition for our survival will not come from Washington. It will come when the people, united, bring it to Washington. To the powers that dominate the president and the world, the most unspeakable reality of all would be our discovery as a people all over this country and this globe of a force more powerful than war. The arc of the universe bends toward justice on earth if we can believe in it and act on it. Let it be. It's your turn to respond. My wife, Shelley, is the only person I know who has 4 parents from the Central Intelligence Agency. That is literally true. Her father worked for the OSS during World War II, the predecessor to the CIA. And of course, when the CIA came into being, he went into the CIA. Her mother worked for the CIA. That's how she and her father met. And when they divorced, where did they marry? They, of course, married into the company. So both her stepfather and her stepmother are CIA. full-time CIA employees their entire adult lives. And I won't go into all the details, but there are other members of the family currently who are members of the Central Intelligence Agency. It's all in the family, as you know. Yeah, the situation is not the same. It's more complex, and it's in some ways worse as well as better. If we can, quote, absorb, if you want to use that term in a negative sense, the assassination of a president by his own national security state without dealing with it, if we can go along with, without dealing with it, the assassination of the greatest prophet, nonviolent prophet in American history, Martin Luther King, by his own national security state, if we can swallow the assassination of a president-to-be, Robert F. Kennedy, just as he was turning by his election, as his winning the nomination, winning the California primary, which turned him in the direction of the nomination. If we can absorb that one on top of the other two, and you could start going down the events that have occurred since 1963, if we can do all of that, where does it leave us? If we can not respond truthfully enough and deeply enough through the kind of vision that King understood, if we can't turn this around during those years, this is not an upward slope. This is not an upward slope. This is a certain question, not just about what happened, 47 years ago. It's a question about what's happening right now and what we see, And a lot of people don't want to go there to the Kennedy assassination. I don't want to go there. People whom I respect. Some of our best analysts in this country do not want to go there. And I mean the best left analysts. And I mean radio programs that you listen to, people whose books you respect, they do not want to go there any more than they want to go to other dark events. If we don't go there, we go down, 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 down. If we do go there, we can be hopeful. I have never been more hopeful than I have been by understanding the assassination of John F. Kennedy. What worse point can you come to in human history than Khrushchev and Kennedy about to take us into a total nuclear war? There's nothing worse than that. And then all of a sudden something happens, which we don't have any understanding of whatsoever, and nobody since then is interpreting it in terms of what really happened. Once we understand what happened, we understand what can happen. Not just to those guys who are the most unlikely guys in the world, perhaps, to do such a thing, but they did it. If they can do it, we can do it, and we can organize, we can come together in all kinds of ways.
His son Patrick died in August of 1963, and that brought him and his wife Jacqueline more closely together than they had ever been. And it also inspired very powerfully his work on the Test Ban Treaty. Just 2 weeks before his own son died, he was talking about the death of children as being the primary motivating force for him in the Test Ban Treaty, and then his own child died. And then he went even more into it. He said, I don't care if I lose the next election, I'm going to get this through the Senate. And he did. He did. And then in the fall, a month before he died, he was at a Harvard football game, and at halftime he said, I want to get the hell out of here. And he had his assistants block the police so that the media couldn't follow him or anything. And he went to his son's grave, and he basically was saying goodbye. And then shortly after that, he went to his father, who was crippled by various attacks and couldn't speak anymore. And he just spent a full day with his father at Hyannisport. He knew. The most powerful scene in which he knows is when his favorite poem is recited. His favorite poem is called Rendezvous. Alan Seeger wrote it. Alan Seeger was, like John F. Kennedy, a student at Harvard. Alan Seeger was, like John F. Kennedy, a man who volunteered for war, in his case, the First World War. And Alan Seeger was a man who, unlike John F. Kennedy, but almost like Kennedy, died in the First World War. And Seeger anticipated all of that And he made a commitment. I mean, he did it voluntarily, like Kennedy. He voluntarily went into the war zones and everything. And he wrote a poem called "I Have a Rendezvous with Death." It's a powerful poem. T.S. Eliot thinks it's a great poem. And this was Kennedy's favorite poem, his favorite poem. And when he and Jacqueline were married, when they came back to Hyannisport after their honeymoon, he told her about this poem. She memorized it. She memorized it, and she would recite it back to him. "I have a rendezvous with death." So then in the fall of 1963, Kennedy, one day, is having a National Security Council meeting. These are all the guys that we're talking about, some of whom are plotting his death. These are his top security advisors, same as Obama had, who are giving him no assistance and no support in his turning toward peace. He has to push it through on his own, They're sitting in a circle in the Rose Garden. It was a beautiful fall day, just a month before the assassination, October of '63. So he said, let's go out in the Rose Garden to have our National Security Council meeting. So they're sitting in this circle with JFK, and who comes up? 5-year-old Caroline Kennedy, 5 years old. She starts tugging at her father's suit, and he tells her, go over there, your mother's riding a horse, it's this kind of thing. She just keeps tugging, and finally he turns his attention to her, stops the whole National Security Council meeting, and says, "What do you want?" And she stands there, and having memorized the poem, she recites, "I have a rendezvous with death," looking right in her father's eyes, with the National Security Council sitting in stone silence in a circle around them. That is the moment. That is the moment. That is the moment. There are many moments like that in Kennedy's story. I just had no knowledge, no understanding, no sense of this. There are many moments like that. He had the raven on his shoulder all his life. When death is your companion, you can do some things that you can't do when you're afraid of death. He was not afraid of death. He was not afraid of death. He was his companion. I have a rendezvous with death. That's the essence of the story. If you have that kind of freedom, then of course you can. And he had no way of protecting himself from assassins, especially when it's his national security state. And he talked about it all the time. He talked about it to Jacqueline. He talked about it to Jacqueline that morning of November 22, 1963. He said, somebody can get me today. He said, last night would have been a perfect time to get me. He said, somebody can get me from a tall building today. He said that the morning of his assassination to Jacqueline Kennedy. And he even mimed it in front of her that morning, just after they had had breakfast in Fort Worth and before they got on the plane to Dallas. He had this totally absorbed into his being. That's the story. That's the real story. It's not that the military-industrial complex is all powerful. It's that each of us can get a certain amount of freedom to do what we have to do, no matter where we are. No matter where we are, even if we're President of the United States. But you have to be willing to go the route. And remarkably enough, a president was. It's not like that's going to happen every day. But remarkably enough, a president was at the precise moment when we most needed it. And that's the arc of the universe that bends toward justice on earth. A year ago or so, the National Catholic Reporter, a newspaper, published a small letter to the editor by someone who had read JFK and the Unspeakable. And this person recommended it very highly. A woman, this is one small letter. It's not a big editorial, it's not anything. One woman in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, read that letter. So she said, I'm going to read this book. So she went out and read it. And she was moved by it. So the story, we're not talking about book, we're talking about the story as I described it tonight of what happened. And so she said to her husband, I want you to read this. So he read it. And he said, this is important. So what happened then was that woman and that man phoned their daughter. And they said, you have to publish this. Because she happened to be the publisher of Simon & Schuster paperback books. She did it.
She did it. She did it. And every step of the process since then, I've been wondering, okay, when does this just all come down? You know, somebody discovers what's going on here and this all gets shattered. Well, so far that hasn't happened. And a lot of people within this structure that I never anticipated working with on this process helped out. So what I believe is what Gandhi told us about experiments in truth. What I'm doing here is this is just an experiment in truth. And each of us has our truth, you know, and we all have our truth, and the truths come together. This is Gandhi's vision. It's a vision of a lot of other people, but truth is God. So go for it. Go for the truth without reservation and totally, and see where it goes, and you're going to be surprised. Yeah. That's the story.